Welcome. You've made it here. The day is behind you now, with its choices and transactions, its numbers and noise. Let all of that fade, like coins dropping gently to the bottom of a well. Tonight, let's take a different kind of journey, not through markets or balance sheets, but through time and meaning, through the quiet story of how we learn to trade, to trust, to share value across space and across generations. But before we begin, consider subscribing so you don't miss our almost daily video stories. And if you're still awake, let us know where you're tuning in from. It's a comfort sometimes to know we're not on this journey alone. This is the story of money, not just coins or paper, not just digits in an account, but the deeper thread of connection that runs from the first barter to the most complex systems of today. From the earliest exchanges between neighbors, to the birth of coins and the shimmer of gold, to banks and paper notes and digital clouds, to the dreams and doubts that follow every form of value we've ever held. You don't need to remember it all. There are no tests here. Let your thoughts soften. Let your breath ease. Let this story move through you like a slow current. You are part of this story too, because money is not just a system. It's something we've all agreed to believe in, together. And like the stars, it doesn't mind if you drift away as you listen. So now, let us begin. Picture this: a time before coins, before numbers written on paper, before the gentle chime of a cash register. A time when value was immediate, tangible, felt in the hands. In the earliest communities, when the world was quieter and smaller, people exchanged what they had for what they needed. The hunter brought meat to the farmer. The farmer offered grain to the potter. The potter gave vessels to the weaver. And so the circle turned, slowly, naturally, like seasons changing. There was something beautiful in this simplicity. Every exchange was a conversation. Every trade required looking into another person's eyes, understanding their needs, finding the balance between what you could give and what you hoped to receive. But even in this gentle world, problems arose like morning mist. What if the farmer didn't need meat today? What if the potter had no use for grain? What if the value of one chicken couldn't quite match the value of 3 baskets? But 4 baskets was too much? The challenge wasn't just practical. It was deeply human. How do you measure the worth of things when worth itself seems to shift like shadows? How do you preserve value across time, across seasons, across the unpredictable rhythms of need and abundance? These questions whispered themselves into existence, and slowly, very slowly, humanity began to listen. As communities grew and spread like ripples on water, certain objects began to shimmer with special meaning, not because they were the most useful, necessarily, but because they carried something more: agreement. Cowrie shells, smooth and curved like tiny moons, became treasures far from any ocean. Their beauty was part of their power, but so was their rarity, their durability, the way they felt solid and real in a cupped palm. In places where shells never washed ashore, they became magical, tokens of distant waters, carriers of value that everyone somehow understood. Salt, white as snow and precious as tears, became currency where it was scarce. Think of it, something so essential to life, so carefully gathered and preserved, that its very presence meant survival. To trade in salt was to trade in life itself. Cattle wandered through economies as living, breathing money. They grazed and multiplied, storing value in muscle and milk, in the promise of future herds. Our word, capital, still echoes with the memory of cattle. Pecuniary, with the ancient value of livestock. But perhaps most mysteriously, objects with no practical use at all began to hold tremendous worth. Rare stones, peculiar feathers, carved bits of bone or wood, things that mattered only because communities decided they mattered. This was humanity's first great leap of financial faith, agreeing that meaning could be assigned, that value could live in symbols as much as in substance. These proto-monies taught us something profound about ourselves. We were creatures capable of collective imagination, able to believe in the same stories about worth and meaning. We were learning to trust not just in things, but in each other's agreement about things. In the fertile valleys between the Tigris and Euphrates, where civilization first learned to write its dreams into clay, something remarkable happened. Humans began to keep track. Before they recorded epic poems or royal decrees, before they preserved love letters or laws, they wrote about trade, about who owed what to whom, about grain stored and goods delivered, about the invisible threads of obligation that bound communities together. Clay tokens, small and smooth, became the first calculators, a cone for a measure of grain, a sphere for livestock, a cylinder for land or labor. These humble objects were filed away in clay envelopes, creating the world's first contracts, the earliest promises preserved in earth and fire. The scribes who pressed these symbols into wet clay were doing more than bookkeeping. They were creating permanence from the temporary, making memory from the moment. They were teaching humanity that value could be stored not just in objects, but in information. Can you imagine the wonder of those first written numbers? The revolutionary idea that you could capture a transaction, hold it still, refer back to it seasons or years later. That trust could be documented, that agreements could outlive the people who made them. This was the birth of economic memory, the beginning of our long conversation with numbers, with records, with the complex dance between present value and future obligation. Every spreadsheet, every bank statement, every digital transaction trace their ancestry back to those simple clay tokens, impressed by hands that have turned to dust, but whose intentions live on in the systems we use today. As trade routes stretched like threads across continents, as caravans moved slowly through desert nights and ships waited for favorable winds, the need for portable, divisible, durable value became urgent. Metals answered this call with their quiet perfection. Gold, luminous and uncorrupting, never tarnishing, never breaking down, seemed to hold sunlight itself. Silver, bright as moonbeams, more common but still precious. Copper, humble but useful, workable, and warm to the touch. But metals offered more than beauty or durability. They could be weighed, divided, combined. A handful of silver could become a bracelet or be melted into smaller pieces. Value became fluid, measurable, precise in ways that cattle or shells could never be. Grains, too, became currency in their steady abundance. Barley and wheat, rice and corn. The staff of life transformed into the measure of worth. Here was money you could literally live on, value that would never become completely worthless because it could always feed you. This era taught us about intrinsic value, the idea that money could be worth something in itself, not just as a symbol or promise. A gold coin was valuable even if the kingdom that minted it fell to ruins. A sack of grain could sustain you even if every government collapsed. There was comfort in this tangibility, this rootedness in the physical world. You could feel wealth in your hands, taste it, even eat it if times grew desperate. Money was not yet an abstraction, not yet a leap of faith. It was real in the most fundamental sense. But even as people treasured this concrete value, they were unknowingly preparing for the next great leap. the moment when trust would become more important than the material itself. In the ancient kingdom of Lydia, where the river Pactolus carried flecks of gold down from the mountains, a revolutionary idea was born. Someone, perhaps King Alyattes, perhaps his successor Croesus, decided to stamp authority into metal itself. The first coins were small, bean-shaped pieces of electrum, a natural alloy of gold and silver. But their power came not from their material alone, but from the mark pressed into their surface, the guarantee of a king, the promise of a state, the weight of authority made visible and portable. This was trust made tangible. No longer did traders need to weigh and test each piece of metal. No longer did they need to wonder about purity or authenticity. The stamp said, "This is worth what we say it's worth. The government has vouched for it. You can believe in it." The innovation spread like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. Greek city-states began minting their own coins, each bearing the symbols of their identity. Athens' owl, Corinth's Pegasus, Syracuse's dolphins. These weren't just economic tools. They were statements of independence, of sovereignty, of a community's right to define its own value. Roman coins carried the faces of emperors to the farthest corners of the empire, spreading not just economic utility, but political power. To accept a Roman coin was to acknowledge Roman authority, to participate in Roman civilization. But perhaps most importantly, coinage taught humanity about standardization. Suddenly, value had a common language. A merchant from Sicily could trade with a trader from Gaul using coins they both understood. Economics began to transcend borders, cultures, languages. This was the beginning of monetary policy, the idea that governments could influence economies through their control of money. It was also the beginning of our long, complex relationship with the institutions that create and back our currency. Across the ancient world, great civilizations were dreaming money into new forms, each adding their own wisdom to humanity's growing understanding of value and exchange. In Greece, where philosophy bloomed like spring flowers, thinkers began to wrestle with deeper questions about money's nature. Was wealth good or corrupting? How should a just society distribute resources? Aristotle wrote about money as a medium of exchange, a measure of value, a store of worth, categories we still use today. But he also worried about money-making for its own sake, the way the tool could become the goal, the means transform into the end. Rome built an empire on roads, laws, and currency. Roman coins were everywhere Roman legions marched, creating one of history's first truly international monetary systems. The denarius became as trusted in Britain as in Egypt, as accepted in Spain as in Syria. But Rome also learned about inflation, about the temptation to debase currency in times of crisis, about how monetary policy could rise or topple emperors. In ancient China, innovation flourished with quiet genius. Paper money appeared there centuries before Marco Polo brought word of it to Europe. The Chinese understood something profound, that money's power lay not in its material, but in the community's faith in the issuing authority. They created systems of credit, banking houses, even something resembling modern checks. India gave the world sophisticated concepts of mathematical calculation, decimal systems, and complex trade networks that stretched from the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean. The subcontinent's monsoon rhythms taught merchants about seasonal credit, about the need to finance long-distance trade across unpredictable weather patterns. Each civilization added layers to money's meaning, like sediment settling into the archaeological record of human cooperation. They all discovered, in their own ways, that money was never just about the physical tokens. It was about the social agreements that made those tokens meaningful. In temples and synagogues, in mosques and monasteries, in the quiet places where people gathered to contemplate the sacred, money posed uncomfortable questions. Christianity wrestled with the paradox of material wealth in a spiritual world. It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God, taught Jesus. Yet the church itself would become one of history's most powerful economic institutions. Medieval monks debated usury, the morality of charging interest, the ethics of profit. Judaism developed complex laws around money and fairness, creating concepts of just price, sabbatical years when debts were forgiven, jubilee years when land was redistributed. These weren't just economic policies. They were moral statements about community, responsibility, and the limits of accumulation in a world where all wealth ultimately belonged to God. Islam brought revolutionary ideas about finance, prohibiting interest while encouraging trade and partnership. The concept of risk sharing, of profit and loss, distributed fairly among participants, created new forms of economic organization. Islamic law developed intricate systems for structuring investments, loans, and commercial relationships within religious constraints. Buddhism taught about the middle way between poverty and luxury, about desire as the root of suffering, about the spiritual dangers of attachment to material wealth. Yet Buddhist monasteries became centers of economic activity, managing lands and resources for their communities. Indigenous cultures around the world developed their own relationships with wealth and value. The Pacific Northwest's potlatch ceremonies turned wealth into social obligation. The rich gained status by giving away their possessions, creating cycles of reciprocity that bound communities together. These spiritual and cultural perspectives remind us that money has always been more than an economic tool. It carries moral weight, social meaning, spiritual implications. Every transaction is also a statement about values, about what we believe is important, about how we choose to relate to each other and to the world. In the narrow streets of medieval cities, in the counting houses of Venice and Florence, in the merchant quarters of Baghdad and Cairo, a new profession was quietly transforming the world: banking. The word itself comes from banco, the bench where Italian money changers sat in marketplaces, surrounded by scales and ledgers, foreign coins, and letters of credit. But these humble benches would become the foundation of modern finance. Medieval bankers solved ancient problems with elegant innovation. How could a merchant in London pay for goods in Constantinople without carrying dangerous amounts of gold across bandit-infested roads? The letter of credit, a promise to pay, backed by the banker's reputation, made long-distance trade safer and more efficient. The Templars, those warrior monks of the Crusades, created perhaps history's first international banking system. A pilgrim could deposit money at a Templar house in Paris and withdraw it in Jerusalem, using an early form of encrypted receipt. They built trust across vast distances, backed by military power and religious authority. Italian banking families like the Medicis, the Fuggers, the Lombards became power brokers who financed kings and funded wars, supported artists and built cathedrals. They learned to spread risk across multiple ventures, to diversify investments, to manage complex international operations from their Renaissance palazzos. But banking also meant wrestling with new moral questions. Was it right to make money from money itself? Could interest be justified as payment for risk, for the banker's time and expertise? Different cultures answered these questions differently, creating the complex patchwork of financial laws and customs that still influences global banking today. The rise of banking marked humanity's growing comfort with abstraction, with the idea that wealth could exist as information, as promises, as relationships rather than just as physical objects. It was another step toward our modern understanding of money as, ultimately, a form of organized trust. In the markets of Tang Dynasty China, while Europe was still struggling through the Dark Ages, merchants were conducting business with something that would have seemed like magic to their Western contemporaries: paper money. It began with practicality. Iron coins were heavy, difficult to transport in large quantities. Copper was better but still cumbersome. Silver and gold were precious but sometimes scarce. So Chinese merchants developed a system of promissory notes, paper certificates that could be exchanged for metal coins from trusted money dealers. The government, recognizing the genius of this system, eventually took it over. By the 11th century, official paper money was being printed under imperial authority, backed by the full faith and credit of the Chinese state. The bills were elegant, complex documents, as beautiful as artwork, printed on special paper with intricate designs that made counterfeiting difficult. This was humanity's boldest leap yet into the abstract nature of value. Paper money had little intrinsic worth. You couldn't eat it, wear it, or make tools from it. Its value existed entirely in the collective agreement that it represented something valuable, that it could be exchanged for things of real utility. The psychological shift was enormous. People were learning to trust not just in physical substances, but in institutions, in governments, in the complex social systems that gave paper its purchasing power. They were accepting that money could be, fundamentally, information, data about debt and credit, about social relationships and economic obligations. When paper money finally reached Europe centuries later, it initially met with suspicion and resistance. The idea seemed almost heretical to people accustomed to the solid reality of metal coins. But gradually, as trade expanded and economies grew more complex, Europeans too discovered the convenience, efficiency, and flexibility of paper currency. Paper money taught us that the most powerful technologies are often not physical tools, but social ones. Shared agreements, collective understandings, institutionalized trust. In the bazaars of Baghdad and the trading houses of Cordoba, while European scholastics debated angels on pinheads, Islamic scholars were developing some of history's most sophisticated financial instruments. The Quran's prohibition of riba, usury, seemed like it might limit Islamic finance, but instead, it sparked incredible innovation. If you couldn't charge interest, how could you fairly compensate lenders for risk and time? How could you structure investments and partnerships? The answer came through concepts like mudaraba, profit-sharing partnerships, musharaka, joint ventures, and ijara, leasing arrangements. These weren't just clever workarounds. They were fundamentally different ways of thinking about finance, emphasizing shared risk and mutual benefit over the simple lender-borrower relationship. Islamic finance developed the hawala system, an informal money transfer method that allowed traders to send funds across vast distances without physically moving gold or silver. A merchant in Damascus could give money to a hawala broker, who would then instruct his counterpart in Delhi to pay an equivalent amount to the intended recipient. The system worked entirely on trust and reputation, creating networks of financial connection that spanned continents. The Islamic world also gave us the concept of the check, from the Arabic sak, bills of exchange, and sophisticated accounting methods that influenced European commercial practices when trade resumed during the Crusades and Reconquista. Perhaps most importantly, Islamic finance emphasized the moral dimension of economic activity. Money was seen not as an end in itself, but as a tool for creating justice, supporting community welfare, and enabling beneficial economic activity. The charging of excessive interest was forbidden not just as bad business, but as a form of social injustice. These principles continue to influence modern Islamic banking, which has grown into a trillion-dollar global industry that offers an alternative vision of how finance might work when guided by ethical principles as well as economic efficiency. In the cobblestone streets of Renaissance Europe, great banking dynasties were writing the first chapters of modern capitalism with gold ink and careful handwriting. The Medici family of Florence transformed from wool merchants into Europe's most powerful bankers, financing trade routes that stretched from England to the Black Sea. Their innovations in double-entry bookkeeping, international exchange, and credit instruments laid groundwork for modern banking. But they also understood that financial power was incomplete without political influence. They became patrons of art, sponsors of architecture, and eventually produced 4 popes and 2 queens of France. In Germany, the Fugger family accumulated wealth that rivaled kingdoms. Jakob Fugger, known as the Rich, was possibly the wealthiest individual in human history when adjusted for his era's total wealth. The Fuggers financed the election of Holy Roman emperors, funded Spanish exploration of the New World, and built the world's first social housing project. Their business network spanned Europe and reached into the Americas. These banking families pioneered techniques that seem modern today: diversified portfolios, international currency exchange, sophisticated risk assessment, and what we might now call investment banking. They financed not just trade, but governments, wars, exploration, and colonization. But they also embodied capitalism's inherent tensions. Their wealth created unprecedented individual power, sometimes rivaling or exceeding that of traditional nobility. Their international networks could influence political decisions in multiple countries simultaneously. Their success raised questions about democracy, sovereignty, and the proper relationship between economic and political power. The rise of these banking dynasties marked the beginning of finance as a globalized industry, operating according to its own logic and serving its own interests as much as those of any particular nation or community. It was the birth of what we might recognize as the modern financial system, with all its power, complexity, and contradictions. The age of European exploration and colonization rewrote the world's monetary map with violence and exploitation, but also with unprecedented economic integration. Spanish conquistadors found mountains of silver in Potosí, in what is now Bolivia. The indigenous peoples, enslaved in brutal mining conditions, extracted so much silver that it fundamentally altered global economics. This New World silver flowed through Spanish galleons to European ports, then scattered across trade routes to China, India, and the Ottoman Empire. For the first time in human history, a single monetary system was beginning to span the globe. But this integration came at enormous human cost. Colonial powers imposed their monetary systems on subjugated peoples, often destroying existing economic relationships and forcing participation in European-dominated trade networks. Indigenous currencies, whether shells, copper bars, or iron tools, were systematically replaced with European coins and accounting methods. The Atlantic slave trade created horrific monetary calculations. Human beings bought and sold as commodities, their labor transformed into sugar, tobacco, and cotton that generated enormous profits for European and American merchants. This wasn't just economic activity. It was the monetization of human suffering on an industrial scale. Colonial exploitation concentrated unprecedented wealth in European hands while impoverishing vast regions of Africa, Asia, and the Americas. The wealth of London, Amsterdam, and Paris was built, in part, on the systematic extraction of resources and labor from colonized territories. These historical patterns continue to influence global economics today. Many developing nations still struggle with economic relationships established during colonial periods. Currency systems, trade relationships, and international financial institutions still reflect power dynamics established centuries ago. The colonial period taught harsh lessons about money's relationship to power, about how monetary systems can be tools of domination as well as cooperation, about the ways economic integration can mask or perpetuate profound injustices. In the counting houses of 19th century London, in the treasuries of emerging nations, in the minds of economists and politicians, a beautiful idea was taking shape: that money could be as reliable as the sunrise, as trustworthy as mathematics itself. The gold standard promised to remove human judgment from monetary policy. Gold was finite, difficult to mine, impossible to create artificially. If currencies were backed by gold, then money would have objective value independent of political manipulation or social whim. Economic relationships would be governed by natural law rather than human institution. Britain led the way, formally adopting the gold standard in 1816. The pound sterling could be exchanged for a fixed amount of gold, making it as good as gold anywhere in the world. As British trade and influence expanded, other nations found themselves forced to adopt similar systems to facilitate international commerce. The appeal was enormous. Gold standard currencies were theoretically stable, internationally accepted, and immune to the temptations of excessive money printing that had plagued earlier eras. Trade between nations became simpler when exchange rates were fixed by objective metal content rather than political negotiation. But the gold standard also imposed harsh disciplines. Governments couldn't simply print money to finance wars or social programs. Economic recessions couldn't be alleviated by expanding the money supply. When gold flowed out of a country, its money supply contracted automatically, potentially deepening economic downturns. The system worked reasonably well during the peaceful, prosperous decades of the late 19th century. International trade flourished under predictable exchange rates. Investment flowed more easily across borders when currencies were anchored to universal standards. Yet even during these golden years, critics worried about the system's rigidity. What happened when economic circumstances required monetary flexibility? What if gold supplies couldn't keep pace with growing economies? What if the discipline of gold became a straitjacket that prevented necessary adaptation? These questions would become urgent as the 20th century brought wars, depressions, and economic challenges that would test the gold standard beyond its breaking point. In the aftermath of financial panics and economic crises, governments began to realize that money was too important to be left entirely to markets, too powerful to be managed by private interests alone. The Bank of England, established in 1694, became the model for modern central banking. Originally created to finance King William's war against France, it gradually evolved into something more: a lender of last resort, a guardian of financial stability, a manager of the nation's money supply. Central banks offered governments powerful new tools for economic management. They could lend money to commercial banks during crises, preventing the cascade of failures that had devastated earlier economies. They could influence interest rates, encouraging or discouraging borrowing and investment. They could manage currency exchange rates and international monetary relationships. But central banking also raised profound questions about power and accountability. Who should control money? How much independence should central bankers have from elected officials? How could democratic societies balance technical expertise with political responsibility? The Federal Reserve, created in the United States in 1913 after a series of banking panics, embodied these tensions. It was designed as a quasi-independent institution, insulated from day-to-day political pressure, but ultimately accountable to Congress and the President. Its mandate was broad: maintain employment, control inflation, ensure financial stability. Central banks became the guardians of modern monetary systems, the institutions responsible for maintaining the delicate balance between growth and stability, between private freedom and public interest. They were humanity's attempt to bring scientific management to the ancient art of money. Yet their power also made them targets of criticism and conspiracy theories. Some saw central bankers as wise technocrats protecting society from market excesses. Others viewed them as unelected elites controlling the economy for their own benefit. The debate continues today. By the dawn of the 20th century, something remarkable had happened. Most of the world's major economies had converged on a single monetary system. The classical gold standard represented humanity's first truly global financial agreement, a shared set of rules that governed economic relationships across continents. Under this system, each nation's currency was convertible into gold at a fixed rate. The British pound, American dollar, German mark, French franc, all were simply different names for specific quantities of gold. International trade became almost automatic. Exchange rates were fixed, payments flowed smoothly, and economic integration deepened year by year. The system had an elegant, almost mechanical logic. When a country imported more than it exported, gold would flow out to pay the difference. This reduced the domestic money supply, lowering prices and making the country's goods more competitive internationally. Eventually, trade would balance automatically without government intervention. For investors and traders, the gold standard created unprecedented predictability. A pound sterling in 1900 could be exchanged for the same amount of gold as a pound sterling in 1910. Long-term contracts became easier to negotiate when both parties could be confident about future currency values. But the classical gold standard also revealed its limitations. The system was procyclical. It amplified both booms and busts. During recessions, gold would flow out of struggling economies, forcing their money supplies to contract precisely when expansion might have helped. During booms, gold inflows would expand money supplies, potentially fueling dangerous speculation. The gold standard also concentrated enormous power in the hands of gold-producing nations, particularly South Africa and Russia. Discoveries of new gold deposits could flood the world with liquidity, while exhaustion of existing mines could create deflationary pressure. Most dangerously, the gold standard made it difficult for governments to respond to emergencies. When World War I erupted in 1914, belligerent nations found they couldn't finance massive military expenditures while maintaining gold convertibility. One by one, they suspended the gold standard, choosing national survival over monetary orthodoxy. The war marked the beginning of the end for the classical gold standard, though few recognized it at the time. The system that had governed global finance for decades was about to give way to something more flexible, more complex, and ultimately more fragile. The trenches of World War I became the graveyard of monetary orthodoxy. As artillery shells exploded across European battlefields, the gold standard was dying a quiet death in government treasuries and central bank vaults. War costs were enormous, unprecedented, impossible to finance through traditional means. Governments needed to print money, to borrow massively, to mobilize economic resources on scales never before imagined. The gold standard's discipline, its requirement that money supply be limited by gold reserves, became a luxury that nations at war could not afford. One by one, the major powers suspended gold convertibility. Britain, the system's founding nation, stopped redeeming pounds for gold in 1914. Germany, France, Russia followed. The United States maintained gold convertibility domestically, but restricted gold exports. After the war ended, there were attempts to restore the old system. The 1920s saw efforts to return to gold, to rebuild the predictable monetary relationships that had facilitated pre-war prosperity. But the world had changed too much. War debts, reparations payments, and economic instability made the old fixed exchange rates impossible to maintain. The Great Depression delivered the final blow. As unemployment soared and businesses failed, governments found that gold standard discipline prevented the monetary expansion that might have alleviated suffering. Britain abandoned the gold standard permanently in 1931. The United States followed in 1933 when President Franklin Roosevelt prohibited private gold ownership and devalued the dollar. Countries that abandoned gold earliest recovered from the Depression fastest. Those that clung to gold orthodoxy suffered longer and deeper economic pain. The evidence was clear. The gold standard had become a constraint rather than a support for economic prosperity. By the late 1930s, the classical gold standard was history. In its place emerged a world of managed currencies, floating exchange rates, and active monetary policy. Governments had learned that money was a tool to be used, not a natural force to be obeyed. But the transition also created new uncertainties. If money wasn't backed by gold, what gave it value? How could international trade function without fixed exchange rates? What prevented governments from debasing their currencies for short-term political gain? These questions would shape monetary policy for the rest of the 20th century and beyond. In the ruins of the gold standard, humanity made its boldest monetary leap yet, creating money from nothing but collective belief, institutional credibility, and shared social agreements. Fiat money, currency that derives its value from government decree rather than commodity backing, represented a fundamental shift in thinking about value itself. A dollar bill, a euro note, a digital entry in a bank account had worth only because communities agreed they had worth, because institutions promised to honor them, because legal systems enforced their acceptance. This was money as pure information, as social relationship, as organized trust. The printing presses that created paper currency were minting not just tokens of exchange, but symbols of collective faith in governmental institutions and economic systems. The advantages of fiat money became clear quickly. Governments could respond to economic crises by expanding money supplies, lowering interest rates, stimulating employment and investment. Central banks could act as lenders of last resort during financial panics. Monetary policy became a powerful tool for economic management. International trade became more flexible when exchange rates could adjust to economic conditions rather than being fixed by gold content. Countries with different economic circumstances could have currencies that reflected their particular needs and challenges. But fiat money also created new anxieties and responsibilities. Without gold backing, what prevented inflation from spiraling out of control? How could people trust money that existed only as governmental promise? What happened if confidence in institutions eroded? The answer came through institutional design and social learning. Central banks developed sophisticated tools for managing money supplies and controlling inflation. Legal systems evolved to protect currency integrity and punish counterfeiting. International institutions emerged to facilitate cooperation between different national monetary systems. Most importantly, societies learned to trust in their own institutional capacities. Fiat money worked because people believed it would work, because institutions proved worthy of that belief, because the alternatives, barter, commodity money, economic chaos, were clearly worse. This transition to fiat money marked humanity's full embrace of money as a social technology, a collective creation that existed only through shared agreement, but that enabled unprecedented economic cooperation and prosperity. In the prosperous decades after World War II, as suburbs sprawled and consumer culture bloomed, money was learning to travel in new ways. Folded into wallets as thin plastic cards that contained not wealth itself, but promises of wealth, authorizations to borrow. The first credit cards appeared in the 1950s, issued by oil companies and department stores to encourage customer loyalty. But the real breakthrough came with bank cards that could be used at multiple merchants: Bank AmeriCard, later Visa, MasterCharge, later MasterCard, and others that created the infrastructure for modern consumer credit. This was money becoming invisible, dematerialized, abstracted beyond even paper currency. A credit card represented not funds you possessed, but funds someone was willing to lend you based on assessments of your character, capacity, and collateral, the famous 3 C's of credit analysis. The psychological impact was profound. People could make purchases beyond their immediate means, smoothing consumption across time, buying goods today with money they expected to earn tomorrow. Young families could buy homes decades before they could afford to pay cash. Students could invest in education before they had careers to finance it. Credit cards also democratized borrowing in ways that would have been impossible under earlier systems. Previously, credit required personal relationships with bankers, substantial collateral, or family wealth. Now credit became available to anyone who could demonstrate steady income and responsible payment habits. But plastic money also created new forms of financial vulnerability. It became easier to accumulate debt, to lose track of spending, to confuse access to credit with actual wealth. The convenience of credit cards could mask the reality that borrowing always created obligations that eventually had to be met. The credit card industry became a massive economic force, processing trillions of dollars in transactions annually and generating billions in revenue from merchant fees, interest charges, and ancillary services. Credit scoring became a new form of social measurement, creating numerical assessments of trustworthiness that could determine access to homes, cars, and other elements of middle-class life. Credit and plastic money taught modern societies about the time value of money, about the relationship between present consumption and future obligation, about trust as a quantifiable commodity that could be bought, sold, and managed through sophisticated data analysis. As computer networks spread like digital nervous systems across the globe, money began its transformation into pure information, streams of data flowing through fiber optic cables at the speed of light. The first electronic funds transfers were simple replacements for physical processes: payroll deposits that eliminated paper checks, automatic bill payments that moved money on schedule, wire transfers that replaced physical transportation of cash between banks. But gradually, something more fundamental was happening. Money was becoming native to digital environments. ATMs appeared on street corners like electronic tellers, available 24 hours a day, turning any sidewalk into a potential bank branch. Debit cards allowed instant access to account balances, making the distinction between cash and bank money increasingly meaningless. Online banking arrived with the internet, transforming personal finance from a weekly trip to the bank into a constant, always available relationship with your money. You could check balances from anywhere, transfer funds between accounts, pay bills with a few clicks. Banking became something you did rather than somewhere you went. The psychological shift was as significant as the technological one. Money became more abstract, more immediate, more controllable. You could monitor every transaction in real time, categorize spending automatically, receive instant notifications when accounts were accessed. Financial management became a continuous process rather than a periodic reconciliation. E-commerce emerged as online shopping transformed retail, creating entirely new forms of payment and new relationships between buyers and sellers. PayPal, founded in 1998, pioneered secure online payments for strangers, solving the trust problem that had limited internet commerce. Suddenly, someone in Tokyo could buy something from someone in Toronto, with confidence that the transaction would be safe and reliable. Digital payments revealed money's ultimate nature as information. When you bought something online, no physical tokens changed hands. Instead, databases were updated, account balances adjusted, digital records created. The money existed only as patterns of information, yet it was completely real in its economic effects. But digital money also created new vulnerabilities. Hackers could steal money without ever seeing it. System failures could make funds temporarily inaccessible. Privacy became a concern as every transaction created digital trails that could be monitored, analyzed, and potentially misused. The infrastructure requirements were enormous. Digital money needed reliable electricity, sophisticated computer networks, robust security systems, and legal frameworks to protect participants. It represented a triumph of social coordination as much as technological innovation. As smartphones became ubiquitous, mobile payments emerged as the next frontier. Money could now travel in your pocket, instantly available for any transaction. Apps like Venmo, Zelle, and Cash App made person-to-person payments as easy as sending a text message. The digitization of money accelerated financial inclusion in unexpected ways. In parts of Africa and Asia where traditional banking infrastructure was limited, mobile money systems like M-Pesa allowed people to store, send, and receive money using basic cell phones. Suddenly, populations that had been excluded from formal financial systems could participate in digital commerce. Digital banking taught us that money's most essential characteristic isn't its physical form, but its function as a system of record-keeping, a way of tracking obligations and exchanges within communities. Once that insight was clear, the possibilities for innovation became almost limitless. In 2008, as global financial systems teetered on the edge of collapse and trust in traditional institutions reached historic lows, a mysterious figure named Satoshi Nakamoto published a 9-page document that would fundamentally challenge everything humanity thought it knew about money. The Bitcoin white paper described something that seemed impossible, a form of money that required no central authority, no banks, no government backing, just mathematics, cryptography, and a network of computers maintaining a shared ledger of transactions. The technology was called blockchain, and it solved what computer scientists had considered an intractable problem: how to prevent digital money from being spent twice without requiring a trusted central authority to keep track. Instead of trusting institutions, Bitcoin trusted an algorithm, a mathematical process that made fraud practically impossible while keeping all participants anonymous. Bitcoin's early adopters were a curious mix. Cryptography enthusiasts fascinated by the technical elegance, libertarians attracted to money beyond government control, criminals drawn to anonymous transactions, and speculators betting on revolutionary change. For years, Bitcoin existed mainly in internet subcultures, worth pennies when it was worth anything at all. But slowly, quietly, the cryptocurrency ecosystem began to grow. Other digital currencies emerged: Ethereum with its smart contracts, Litecoin as digital silver, thousands of others experimenting with different approaches to decentralized money. Exchanges appeared where cryptocurrencies could be bought and sold with traditional money. Mining operations scaled up to industrial proportions. The appeal was multifaceted. Cryptocurrencies offered potentially lower transaction costs for international transfers, financial access for people excluded from traditional banking, protection against currency devaluation in countries with unstable governments, and investment opportunities in what might be the future of money itself. But cryptocurrencies also revealed the importance of what traditional money systems provided: stability, regulatory protection, dispute resolution, and integration with existing economic infrastructure. Bitcoin's value fluctuated wildly, making it impractical for everyday transactions. Transactions were slow and energy-intensive. When mistakes were made or fraud occurred, there was often no recourse. The environmental cost became a significant concern as Bitcoin mining consumed as much electricity as small countries. The technology's association with criminal activity created regulatory skepticism. Market manipulation and spectacular failures of cryptocurrency exchanges reminded investors that innovation doesn't eliminate risk. It just creates new forms of it. Yet cryptocurrencies also demonstrated the power of decentralized systems, the possibility of money that operated according to transparent rules rather than institutional discretion. They showed that trust could be mathematically enforced rather than socially negotiated, that monetary systems could be global and borderless in ways that national currencies never could be. As central banks began developing their own digital currencies, and traditional financial institutions started offering cryptocurrency services, it became clear that the crypto revolution wouldn't replace traditional money so much as expand the menu of monetary options available to humanity. Cryptocurrencies taught us that money's essential functions, storing value, facilitating exchange, measuring worth, could be separated from the institutional frameworks that had traditionally provided them. Whether this separation would ultimately prove beneficial or dangerous remained an open question. In our interconnected world, where money flows across borders in microseconds and financial decisions made in one country can trigger crises on other continents, the ancient challenges of monetary systems have taken on new complexity and urgency. Inflation, that persistent rise in prices that erodes purchasing power like water wearing away stone, remains one of the most insidious threats to monetary stability. Central bankers fight it with interest rate adjustments and money supply management, but the weapons sometimes prove inadequate to the task. When energy prices spike or supply chains break down or confidence collapses, inflation can spiral beyond policymakers' control. The psychological dimension of inflation is as important as the economic one. When people expect prices to rise, they change their behavior in ways that can make inflation self-fulfilling. Workers demand higher wages, businesses raise prices preemptively, savers flee to assets that might hold value better than money itself. But perhaps even more troubling is the growing inequality that seems to accompany monetary sophistication. Those with access to financial knowledge, investment opportunities, and credit can use monetary systems to build wealth exponentially. Those without such access find themselves increasingly left behind, priced out of housing markets, excluded from wealth-building opportunities, trapped in cycles of debt and financial instability. Modern financial crises reveal the interconnectedness and fragility of contemporary monetary systems. The 2008 financial crisis began with questionable mortgage lending in American suburbs and spread globally, freezing credit markets and triggering the worst recession since the 1930s. The European debt crisis that followed showed how currency unions could become transmission mechanisms for financial contagion. Each crisis teaches harsh lessons about the unintended consequences of financial innovation. Derivatives that were designed to distribute risk sometimes concentrated it instead. Algorithms created to optimize trading sometimes amplified market volatility. Institutions deemed too big to fail became so systemically important that their rescue required taxpayer bailouts that socialized losses while privatizing gains. The speed of modern finance has outpaced the development of regulatory frameworks and democratic oversight. Decisions that affect millions of people are made by algorithms executing thousands of trades per second, by central bankers operating with limited democratic accountability, by private institutions whose risk-taking can threaten entire economic systems. Climate change adds new dimensions to monetary challenges. How should financial systems account for environmental costs that markets have historically ignored? How can monetary policy address the long-term challenges of sustainable development while maintaining short-term economic stability? These modern challenges remind us that money is never politically neutral, never purely technical. Every monetary system embeds assumptions about fairness, efficiency, and social priorities. The question facing contemporary societies is whether democratic institutions can evolve quickly enough to govern financial systems that operate at digital speeds with global reach. Beneath all the technical complexity of modern finance, behind every economic theory and policy prescription, lies something fundamentally human: the psychology of money, the deep emotional and cognitive patterns that shape how we relate to value, exchange, and wealth. Money triggers some of our most primitive instincts. The desire to accumulate resources for future security echoes ancient survival needs. The fear of loss can override rational calculation. The pleasure of acquisition activates the same neural pathways as other forms of reward. We are not purely rational economic actors. We are emotional beings whose financial decisions are shaped by psychology as much as mathematics. Research in behavioral economics has revealed the systematic ways human psychology deviates from economic rationality. We are loss-averse, feeling the pain of losing money more intensely than the pleasure of gaining equivalent amounts. We discount future benefits heavily, preferring smaller immediate rewards to larger delayed ones. We follow crowds during market bubbles and panic during crashes, doing exactly the opposite of what rational analysis would suggest. Cultural differences in money psychology are profound and persistent. Some societies emphasize saving and frugality as virtues. Others celebrate spending and display as signs of success. Some cultures view debt as shameful. Others see borrowing as a normal tool for managing cash flow and building wealth. Individual money psychology is often formed early in life and shaped by family experiences, cultural messages, and personal financial traumas or successes. People who experienced financial insecurity as children may become compulsive savers or, conversely, reckless spenders. Those who grew up with wealth may have different relationships to risk and different assumptions about financial security. The digitization of money has psychological implications we're only beginning to understand. When money becomes abstract, numbers on screens rather than physical tokens, it becomes easier to spend but harder to feel. Digital payments can reduce the psychological pain of paying, potentially encouraging overconsumption. At the same time, digital tools can provide unprecedented visibility into spending patterns, potentially supporting better financial decision-making. Social media has created new forms of financial psychology, where spending becomes performance and wealth display, becomes social media content. The pressure to maintain appearances online can drive financial decisions that prioritize image over substance, immediate gratification over long-term financial health. Money psychology also involves deep questions about identity and values. What does it mean to be financially successful? How much is enough? What are we willing to sacrifice for financial gain? How do we balance present enjoyment against future security? Understanding money psychology is crucial for both personal financial health and effective policy design. Financial education that ignores psychological factors often fails to change behavior. Economic policies that assume purely rational actors often produce unintended consequences. The psychology of money reminds us that financial systems don't just move resources, they shape human behavior, influence social relationships, and reflect deeper cultural values about what matters in life. As we stand at the threshold of a new era, watching artificial intelligence reshape entire industries and climate change alter the fundamental parameters of economic life, money itself is evolving toward forms that would be unrecognizable to previous generations. Central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, are emerging as governments' response to cryptocurrency innovation. These digital versions of national currencies promise to combine the convenience and efficiency of digital payments with the stability and regulatory oversight of traditional money. China's digital yuan, the European Central Bank's digital euro pilot, and dozens of other CBDC projects suggest that the future of money may be digital by default. But CBDCs also raise profound questions about privacy and surveillance. Digital money that governments can track completely could enable unprecedented monitoring of economic activity. Every transaction could be recorded, analyzed, categorized. The line between monetary policy and social control could blur in troubling ways. Artificial intelligence is beginning to automate financial decisions that humans have made for millennia. AI algorithms already execute most high-frequency trading, detect fraudulent transactions, and approve credit applications. As these systems become more sophisticated, they may begin to manage entire aspects of the economy with minimal human oversight. The environmental crisis is forcing reconsideration of money's relationship to natural resources. How should financial systems account for carbon emissions, biodiversity loss, and resource depletion? Can monetary policy help address climate change, or will environmental constraints ultimately require new forms of economic organization entirely? Demographic changes, aging populations in developed countries, youth bulges in developing nations, will reshape global financial flows and challenge traditional assumptions about saving, investment, and intergenerational wealth transfer. Space exploration may eventually require new forms of money adapted to multiplanetary commerce. How would economic exchange work across the vast distances between Earth and Mars? What would money look like in low-gravity environments or closed-loop life support systems? But perhaps the most fundamental question about money's future is whether it will remain primarily a technology for facilitating exchange between individuals, or evolve into something more integrated with artificial intelligence, social media, and governance systems. We may be approaching a future where money becomes ambient, embedded in our environment, automatically managing transactions we're barely aware of, integrated with identity systems and social networks in ways that make the boundary between economic and social life increasingly meaningless. Or we may discover that human psychology and social needs require money to maintain certain characteristics: tangibility, scarcity, independence from surveillance, that push back against complete digitization and automation. The future of money will be shaped by choices we make about the kind of society we want to live in, the balance we strike between efficiency and privacy, between innovation and stability, between individual freedom and collective coordination. And now, the journey slows. From the echo of barter to the glow of digital coins, we've drifted through millennia of exchange, of trust, of belief. Money is more than metal or paper or numbers on a screen. It is a story we tell together, a promise we choose to believe, a reflection of how we value time, effort, and one another. Think of it, every coin that ever passed through human hands carried with it the weight of someone's labor, someone's hope. The merchant who counted silver denarii by candlelight, the farmer who traded grain for gold, the child who saved copper pennies in a wooden box. Each transaction was a small act of faith. Faith that tomorrow, this piece of metal, this slip of paper, would still mean something to someone else. We've seen empires rise and fall, their currencies turning to dust with them. We've watched as trust shifted from the weight of gold to the promise of governments, from the rustle of paper to the silent dance of electrons. Yet through it all, the essential truth remains. Money is memory made manifest. It remembers our debts and our gifts. It carries forward the echo of every exchange, every moment when two people agreed that something had value. You don't need to hold on to every detail. Let it settle like dust in quiet sunlight. The story will still be there. You carry it with you, in every choice, every trade, every moment of giving and receiving. Perhaps you'll notice it now, this ancient rhythm. When you hand over $1 for coffee, you're participating in a ritual as old as civilization itself. When you check your bank balance, you're reading a chapter in humanity's longest story. When you decide what something is worth, you're adding your voice to a conversation that began around the first fire, when someone offered meat for flint and both parties smiled. The future will bring new forms, new technologies, new ways of keeping score. But the heart of it, this need to exchange, to balance, to say this for that, will remain. Because money isn't really about the object at all. It's about the agreement, the handshake, the nod, the understanding that we're all in this together, trading pieces of our lives for pieces of others' lives, and somehow, miraculously, it all works out. If sleep is near, let it come. If your breath is slower now, let it stay gentle. You've traveled far, across ages and empires, through the minds of kings and the hands of merchants, and there is nowhere you need to be but here. Rest knowing that you are part of something vast and beautiful. Every time you've trusted, every time you've been trusted, you've woven another thread into this tapestry. Your story, the one you're living right now, is part of money's story. And money's story is part of the larger story of us, of how we learn to live together, to count on each other, to believe in tomorrow. Thank you for joining this quiet journey. And if you're still with us, we'd love to know where you listened from. Consider subscribing, so next time we can drift through another story together. Until then, rest well. You are part of the story. You always have been.